I'd now like to introduce Melody Moezzi. I just learned how to pronounce her name this morning, thanks to a little trick she gave me. I hope I got it right. She's going to show us how she turns adversity into advocacy, and she'll share her personal and political perspective on navigating life with bipolar disorder. Welcome, Melody.
I am thrilled to be here among so many extraordinary people. I want to thank everyone at ASHA International, especially Gayatri, who it's amazing to be able to be in the same place. I don't know if white people know this, but as two brown women, we're usually not allowed to be in the same place together at the same time. So thank you for that opportunity. We're just tokens, but here we can be human. So thank you, and thank you to all the extraordinary speakers. Ebony, that was beautiful. I'm thrilled to have heard it, and I just ruined my mic, but thank you. And I'm delighted, and Diana, that breathing, beautiful, thank you. And I'm so excited for the rest of this conference. And I thank all of you in the audience for being here, because doing this, speaking publicly about having a mental health condition as a proud Iranian American Muslim woman specifically, and in my case, that mental health condition is bipolar type 1. I'm cutting off the disorder, I'm not using that word anymore. And doing that without shame is a huge part of my treatment. It's part of how I stay well. That said, this is still something that's very hard for me to talk about. And I am someone who is very used to talking about things that other people find hard to talk about, and I don't. I speak and write a lot about politics, religion, race, gender, sexual orientation, gender identity. And doing all of that has garnered me death threats and rape threats. I have never earned a death threat or a rape threat for speaking about mental health. And yet, I get nervous. With me, like I was on the speech and debate team in high school. I have always enjoyed, put a microphone in front of me and I'm happy. But talking about this, the first time I was invited to talk about this, I realized how much it scared me. And not just scared me, truly terrified me for the first time in my life. And I was invited to an alumni celebration, not to my law school, but to a facility where I had been a patient several years prior, and I was to come back as a model mental patient, having achieved whatever I had achieved. And I was like, this is gonna be easy. It's all patients and their family members, and I had been one of those patients, so I knew it would be an easy crowd, but I just got up and I started bawling, sobbing, there was nothing dignified about it. I just snot, hot mess. And so when I realized how scared I was, I took note, because the thing about fear is that it keeps you sick. And I've learned as a writer, as an activist, as an artist, and as a human being, that if you find yourself afraid of something, that is where you need to go. That is how you heal, that is how you grow, that is how you recover, and as far as I'm concerned, that's where the best art comes from. So thank you for being here and letting me face that fear, and in the process being part of my journey and allowing me to share a bit of my story here today. So what is that story? I'm an activist. I've been an activist since I was a kid. I staged my first protest when I was 8 years old to get the ice cream man to come to our neighborhood. I considered it a grave human rights violation that he would not come to our neighborhood. We lived on a very steep hill, and we could hear him go to all the other neighborhoods, and we would run behind our backyards, try to get him in, we never made it in time. So I got all the neighborhood stakeholders together, which was about 3 children, and we made signs, and we went to the bottom of the hill, and mine said, "Ice cream man, wooden shoe wants you," because we lived on Wooden Shoe Lane. And within a week, he came to our neighborhood. And to this day in Dayton, Ohio, he still comes to our neighborhood. So that was the most successful endeavor I've ever had as an activist in terms of when I started and what my goal was and achieving that goal. After that, it became a little harder. In high school, I started my Amnesty International chapter. I spent my Friday nights when my friends were going to football games. I was standing outside of Shell gas stations, protesting what they were doing in Ogoniland in Nigeria and what they still do to this day in terms of taking the oil out, poisoning people, killing people, and at that point they had killed 9 Ogoni activists. So I was holding their signs with a few other high school students. That's what I was doing. And then, like a lot of people who were activists, I thought, and I was one of those kids who adults would always be like, you should be a lawyer. Which, P.S., they never say is a compliment. Like, that's not, I always took it as a compliment anyway. But I was always interested in justice since the time that I was a kid. So I thought that's what you do. If you're interested in social justice, you go to law school. So I went to law school wanting to be an international human rights lawyer. The first week I realized you can't enforce international human rights law. So that was disappointing. But I was there, so I finished, graduated law school, passed the bar. While I was there, I wrote my first book about young Muslim Americans. It was called War on Error. And after that, I realized pretty quickly that when that book was published, that I could change minds so much faster than I could change the law. And I knew living, and I went to law school in Atlanta. I've lived in the South. I live in North Carolina now for about 15, going on 20 years now. So I know you can pass whatever law you want. Doesn't mean people are gonna follow it, right? But if you change someone's mind, you've got them for life. You don't need the law. So that's what I wanted to do. Unfortunately, at the age of 29, right when my career was getting started, like so many of us with mental health conditions, I ended up having an acute manic episode and a psychotic break, and being diagnosed with bipolar type 1, and not knowing what that meant at all. Like a lot of people with bipolar disorder, I was misdiagnosed for a decade. For most people, it takes about 8 to 10 years to get a proper diagnosis. And during that time, I attempted suicide. I was hospitalized once for a depressive episode in that suicide attempt, which was during the last semester of my last year of law school. And if there are any lawyers here, are there any lawyers here? Fellow, wow. You're just not willing to stand up after I said what I said. Yeah, so any lawyer will tell you, like, if it's a choice to kill yourself, you're going to do it the first semester of your first year, not the last semester of your last year. So just to tell you how irrational that was not a choice. That was the result of an illness that was not being treated. So eventually, when I finally got this diagnosis, what happened was I had this, what is called a switch. I went from being deeply depressed to acutely manic effectively overnight. And it started off beautiful and spiritual and mystical, and it was a religious experience like none I've ever had, and then quickly became a clinical experience, right? And I have come to accept that something can be a clinical and a spiritual experience at once. That has been sort of the jumping off point for my third book that's coming out in March, called The Rumi Prescription, How an Ancient Mystic Poet Changed My Modern Manic Life. Which is now available for pre-order, by the way. So that idea, what happened was my spiritual community took the clinical side away from me, and the medical community took the spiritual side away from me. The medical community said this cannot be anything spiritual at all. It's purely clinical. And then my fellow Muslims were like, this is jinn. If you're Muslim, you know what jinn is. If you're not, you can Google it. But the thing is, they didn't accept that this could also be a spiritual gift, right? That this had to be some sort of spiritual curse. And in my experience, it had definitely been a gift, especially initially. But there were hallucinations and delusions, auditory and visual in my case. I thought I was a prophet. I thought I'd won the lottery. I thought I was a high-level advisor to Barack Obama, which I was not. And eventually I thought that I could fly, which was highly inconvenient because we lived on the 20th floor of an apartment complex in Atlanta. And my husband, having never had any interaction with the mental health system, called the police, not knowing what to do, like so many Americans do, called the police. And I am so lucky that I was not shot and I was not arrested in a country where our largest mental health facilities are jails and prisons. I was, however, like Guthrie, put in isolation. And I think those of us who've been in what they euphemistically call isolation or seclusion, but is solitary confinement, which it should be noted, in this country we use more than any other country on the planet, and that we use it for both treatment and for punishment, despite the fact that it has proven ineffective at both and in fact counterproductive. It actually induces symptoms of mental health conditions in people who don't already have them. In my book, in my second book, Haldol and Hyacinths, which is available for sale back there, I compare it to using laxatives to treat diarrhea, which is exactly what it is. So I went through that experience, and in this book, in the third book that will be out in March, there's a poem by Rumi where he says, is there anyone who speaks Farsi? God, I'm just going to keep asking questions. No one's going to. If there is, so zar talab gashti khud avval zar budi. Yani, meaning you went out in search of gold far and wide, but all along you were gold on the inside. That was what the manic episode allowed me to see, that gold inside. And once you become aware of that you are part of something bigger and that it's within you, no one can take that away. And I was really blessed to have had that experience. But the isolation was incredibly traumatizing to the point that I still have nightmares about it. And that was 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago now. The last time I had a nightmare, woke up screaming, was 2 weeks ago. And I've had treatment for this. I had EMDR, if anybody knows what that is, and it was very helpful. It still hasn't stopped the nightmares completely. But even harder than that isolation was the fact that in these facilities, I was told to lower my expectations for my life by trained mental health professionals. And this is me talking to all of you who are trained mental health professionals. Don't do this. Don't do this to people. Because I'm sitting in a chair across from a woman who has never met me before in her life, has some sort of file in her hand, God knows if it's even mine, and looks at me, having never met me, and says, you need to lower your expectations for your life. And at this point in my life, I had graduated law school, I had passed the bar, I had earned a master's in public health from one of the top universities in the country. I was already a longtime activist. I had published my first book. I was living in Georgia at the time. I had won a Georgia Author of the Year award that year for that book while I was in the hospital. And in this facility, I got my medical records to write my second book about this. And over and over, they had written, patient has delusions that she's an author and a lawyer. Yeah. So who is the crazy one in this scenario, right? Like, your job is to help me distinguish delusion from reality, and you can't even know what my reality is. You can't Google me to find out, let alone ask my family that's really deeply involved in my treatment. Maybe she is these things. They couldn't believe I could have accomplished the things I already had, right? They thought that was impossible. And P.S., like, I had no proper diagnosis. I was being given medication that actually made things worse for me in some cases. And still I managed to do all of that. So now that I have a proper diagnosis, you've told me there's treatment for this, of course I can do more. So when this woman, who was easily twice my age, told me you need to lower your expectations for your life, I looked at her in the most fragile state of my life and I said, girl, raise yours. Thank you. And that applause is for my parents, my incredible immigrant Iranian parents who raised me to always expect more of myself, even and especially when the rest of the world expected less of me, whether it was because of my gender, my religion, my skin color, whatever bullshit reason people could pull out to say, we're gonna expect less of you because of this. Ever since I was a kid, because of my parents, I've always been able to identify it as a bullshit reason. So when she said this, I thought, this is yet another reason that people will expect less of me because I have a mental health condition, and I knew it was garbage, right? And as much as I knew it was garbage, I still lived in the society that we live in. So I still felt that shame that is so insidious that even with the great parents and the great upbringing that I had, I couldn't shake it. I had never been ashamed. I was born in 1979, the year of the so-called Islamic Revolution, and growing up from the time the two countries I'm from, Iran and America, have been enemies, the US especially, wanting to drop bombs on us, actually did drop bombs on us through Iraq. My entire life, that's how it's been, right? But I have never, no matter whether I'm in Iran or in the US, I've never been ashamed of being Iranian. I've never been ashamed of being American. I've never been ashamed of being Muslim, no matter how deeply politically inconvenient that has become. And I should also say, I had a pancreatic tumor that nearly killed me when I was 20. I was never ashamed of my pancreatic tumor either. Worth noting, right? But suddenly, for the first time, the people around me, even my parents, were telling me not to be ashamed, but to be quiet. But the thing about silence is that it breeds shame. You can't not have it breed shame. And that shame induces stigma, and that shame and stigma are far more disabling. I say this as somebody who has visual and auditory hallucinations if I don't take my medication properly, far more disabling than any mental health condition. You will never convince me otherwise. But I've learned, having been an activist for so long, that when people tell you to be quiet about something, it is often because you have something important to say. When you tell yourself to be quiet about something, it's even more important, right? But we don't pay attention to that. And I'm incredibly lucky that I'm not a quiet person, naturally. I'm not sure you can tell. But especially having witnessed what I did and experienced what I did in the hospital, I couldn't continue. I couldn't in any way be quiet about that. And the blessing of having been an activist before and having fought specifically what I had before, I've been fighting Islamophobia since that word entered our lexicon, right? So having all this experience fighting Islamophobia, I saw so many parallels between this fight that I was now taking on against saneism, or the discrimination against those with mental health conditions, and the fight that I had been fighting for so long against Islamophobia. First off, we're not some small minority of people. Muslims are about 1.8 billion people around the world. We make about a quarter of the planet. So not a tiny minority, right, of people. Likewise, with people with mental health conditions, the data is not as good, and a very conservative estimate would be roughly 1 billion people around the world. In this country alone, about half of us in our lifetimes will deal with some sort of mental health condition. So again, not a tiny minority of people. And in my experience fighting Islamophobia, I was very used to hearing a lot of people tell me one thing, always white people telling me the same thing, you don't look Muslim. And so when people started saying, you don't look crazy, I was actually really prepared and ready for that. I'd been hearing it for a long time. And my gut reaction when people say either of those things is very strong, and I've had to suppress it, and I'm proud to say I no longer say it, but my gut reaction, one that I did spend many years saying out loud, was, you don't look stupid. And you clap because it feels so good in the moment, right? But it doesn't accomplish anything. And I can't blame these people for thinking Muslims are terrorists even. And I go to audiences, people stand up and call me that. People tell me to go back to my fucking country. I'm sorry, I was born in Chicago, by the way. So being used to that, I still think they're deeply misinformed, and I try as much as I can not to blame them, because these are communities, people with mental health conditions and Muslim, these communities are deeply misrepresented, misunderstood. They endure tons of negative stereotypes, especially with respect to violence, despite the fact that we, as Muslims and as people with mental health conditions, are far more likely to be victims of violence, right? If you think post 9/11, what happened? Who were the people who were killed the most? It doesn't take lots of thinking, but the data is there. The data clearly shows Muslims were the ones who suffered the most from all the wars that came from that. And likewise, with people with mental health conditions, we are far more likely to be victims of violence than the general population, and certainly than to be perpetrators, and yet we are always portrayed as the perpetrators of violence. So all of this to say, I was fucking prepared for this. I was made for this fight, right? I knew all of this, the fighting Islamophobia had prepared me so much, which goes to show as minoritized communities, we are especially well prepared for these fights because we've been fighting them for a lot longer. That said, it is still incredibly hard for us to invite more discrimination into our lives. Like when my parents, when I was like, I'm gonna write about having bipolar disorder, they were not thrilled. Because, my dad was like, it is not enough for you. You are woman, you are Iranian, you are Muslim. No, Dad, it's not. But they've grown to be very, very supportive. But the truth is, in minoritized communities, there is a deep, deep mistrust in a legitimate mistrust of the medical community in a lot of cases. And I was so glad to hear Ebony bring up this topic of trust, because it's so important, right? There is a legitimate, until we realize that there's a legitimate mistrust of systems that are routinely racist, sexist, homophobic, transphobic, ableist, in these institutions that are routinely like that, then we're not going to be able to get past it, right? I live in North Carolina, where up until the 1970s, we had a eugenics board that sterilized thousands of African Americans for being feeble-minded. So if you're Black and in North Carolina, you can understand maybe you might not want to come forward and say, I feel like I'm dealing with a mental health situation, because historically they have sterilized you for it, against your will, against your knowledge, sterilized you for it, and still haven't properly paid reparations, let alone just recently admitting to it. And I should say North Carolina is not the only state that had these eugenics boards. Likewise, if you turn and look at the LGBTQ community, being gay was considered a mental illness until the 1970s. Being trans was considered a mental illness until last year by the World Health Organization. So why would you yell at us for not seeking help if when you do, you identify the most beautiful parts of ourselves and you say that's illness? Bullshit. We're not willing to buy it. And that's why we don't trust these systems. And the systems and the people within those systems are the ones who need to do the work and start gaining our trust back, because you legitimately lost it and you legitimately need to try and gain it back. So if we want mental health to be treated as the human rights and the civil rights issue that it absolutely is, we need to start seeing and learning from the connections between different civil rights and human rights movements and realize that we are within those systems, right? Those are our own fights, and those are the fights against racism, sexism, ableism, classism, homophobia, transphobia, anti-Semitism, colonialism, all of these nasty isms and phobias that absolutely affect our mental health, and not just our mental health, our cardiac health, so much of our other health. There is data to show that racism affects your cardiac health. So this is not, and of course these things are all related, mental health and cardiac health, all of it. We still haven't come to the point, and I think that's something that's so great about ASHA International, is that this holistic idea that it's all related, it's all connected, and our society has yet to come to that point to recognize that all these things are related. And examples of that, I bring up the LGBTQ community, partly because I think there is no movement that has taught us this better, that sharing your story matters, coming out, being public matters. It changes minds, it changes lives, and it saves lives in communities where we have higher rates of suicide, right? It makes people less ashamed to be who they authentically are, and in fact proud, as they should be. And it helps us when we learn from these different movements, when we see these connections, we're able to see, for example, the real connections between the criminalization of mental health conditions in the world we live in where, as I mentioned, our largest mental health facilities are jails and prisons, and the criminalization of blackness and brownness in this country, where more Black men are currently in the criminal justice system, that's in jail, in prison, or on parole, than were enslaved in 1850. So it's not unrelated that over the last 4 years, roughly a quarter of those, and that's a very conservative estimate, some estimates are as high as 50%, a quarter of those killed by police were people in mental health crisis. So not also a coincidence that over the last 4 years, about a quarter of those who were killed by police have been Black in this country. Point being, race is a mental health issue. Mental health is a race issue. We need to stop treating them like they are two separate issues, because they are not, and because we will not, thank you. We will never be able to fight these struggles effectively in isolation. We have to start fighting them together. And the last thing I want to say is, in this fight, in fighting them together, we also have to start recognizing that those of us with mental health conditions, our minds are allies in this fight. And the last thing I want to do is romanticize the condition I have. I told you I'm trying not to use the word disorder anymore because I consider it, in my case, bipolar, more of a reality. I mean, like not a disorder, a situation, a syndrome even, because that's not all it is, right? And I think we need to start accepting that if there's something, when your mind works differently, if there is something, whether it's bipolar disorder or schizophrenia or schizoaffective disorder or autism or dyslexia or depression or whatever it is that makes your mind work differently, there is something beautiful and something valuable about that, because as much as we may have problems that other people do not have, we are able to see solutions where other people cannot see them. And that is worth celebrating. Absolutely, I have 5 minutes left. So it is worth celebrating because working together we can make those solutions realities. And I think it's high time that we stop relying on ordinary minds to solve extraordinary problems. Like so many of you, I assume in this room, I have been so moved by the global climate movement led by young people right now. Greta Thunberg, I'm sure a lot of you have seen her on television speaking, this teenage girl who may well save the planet, has Asperger's syndrome, has dealt with severe depression, including selective mutism, has an extraordinary mind that has allowed her tenacity, certainly related to her Asperger's syndrome, right? So you want to call this a disability, go ahead. But if you want to solve a big problem like climate change, no offense to all of you who have ordinary minds, but you're not going to solve this. You're not. You have to come to us. You have to come to people who have minds that work differently. If you have a big problem, then we're going to solve it. So don't you dare put us in a chair and tell us to lower our expectations for our life, because we are not broken. We are brave, we are brilliant, we are beautiful, and we are blessed. And don't ever let anybody for a second tell you any different. Thank you.